Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another Survivor What If video. This one being a somewhat timely one considering what we're about to see on Survivor 45, and here I'll be talking about what if every Medevacs player returned for the following season. So obviously this will parallel what we are currently seeing with Bruce on Survivor 45, but going back through Survivor history and talking about what would have happened if a similar thing happened on all these previous seasons. Now, I'll clarify, I'm not including any quits or ejections from the game in this video, even ones that were done due to medical reasons. And obviously, we're not going to fully run through the precise details of every little thing that would have happened with these players, as again, that's kind of ridiculous, as really just never know. But I will give some general thoughts on who I think the Medevac player would have replaced, along with how they could have done in the game. And with that, let's start off, again, going in chronological order here. Sadly, we do have to start talking about Michael Skupin. And here, this will obviously be a situation where he was later placed on Survivor Africa. Now, I think the easy person to replace him with here is Frank. I don't really feel like there's another person in his exact archetype of this older conservative guy that is this clear leader figure for their tribe. I feel like Frank is the perfect person to swap him out for. And really on Samburu, I do feel like that tribe probably plays out the same. I do feel like Skupin would have probably worked with the older people on that tribe, and you probably still have a similar split in the tribe. Now, I will say, I mean, as much as obviously there's enough bad to say about Skupin, I don't know if Skupin's as confrontational of a figure as Frank. Where obviously Frank is someone that had this very open feud with someone like a Brandon, and I think that caused further divides. Well, I don't feel like Skupin is in that same mold, to where while he can certainly annoy people and do some dumb things around camp, I don't feel like he gets into arguments very often. And I think because I do think Skupin could have potentially done better than someone like a Frank. Maybe the divide wouldn't have been as strong, though either way, I do feel like the divide still would have been there. And I still feel like there's no way they're going to allow someone like Skupin to get to the end of the game on a season like Africa here, where again, Baran had this big advantage coming into the merge, and beyond that, Skupin would have obviously been looked at as a pretty big threat out there, so I still don't see Skupin winning the game here. Next up, moving on to Bruce, who now would have been on Survivor Cook Islands, where obviously this was a season divided by race, and through that, when looking at the Puka Puka tribe, I feel like there's a very easy replacement there of Cowboy. Really, there's no one else there that Bruce could have replaced. Once making that swap, again, I feel like it's kind of a similar thing to Skupin, where Cowboy was a very confrontational figure on his tribe, someone that very openly annoyed people, and I feel like Bruce is a lot more palatable. Now, at the same time, Bruce did get on some people's nerves on Panama, but I don't think he's to the point of Cowboy to where everyone pretty much hated him, and he pretty clearly would have been the first boot had they gotten the tribal. Like, I think there's a lot more opportunities there for Bruce to actually make some inroads. Now, again, I don't see Bruce making the long haul. However, at the same time, I don't necessarily see him being this big flame out like Cowboy was, where I could see him more so working alongside the likes of Yule and Becky and them navigating through the game together, though really I don't see him having any real shot at actually winning the game on this season. Now, the next season has a Medevac on it. It's Survivor Micronesia, where we actually get two of them, where you get both James and Penner. So this would be a situation where they're both on Survivor Gabon, and this was kind of a tough one to find who they replace, where really if they were both on Survivor Gabon, at that point you would think they would just make it a captain season to where they would be on separate tribes, though when I was looking at it from a pure archetype perspective, I do feel like both of their replacements would have been on the same tribe. I feel like James is probably going to be swapped out with someone like a GC, while Penner, my first instinct was to swap him out with Randy, obviously both being on Fong. So if we're really trying to separate the two, I did try to find someone to replace him with on Coda. However, I really just ended up swapping out with Bob. For obviously it's not really a one-for-one comparison, though out of the guys on that tribe, I do feel like Bob was the one that was the closest to Penner's archetype. Now, I did a debate for a little bit with Ace, though I just felt like Ace was clearly a lot younger than Penner, so I didn't feel like that was that apt. Though I will also state that really just Survivor Gabon just in general is a very strange season. The fact that obviously these tribes were picked by a schoolyard pick, though once we take that into account, it really just makes this too much of a mess to really think through all of that. But really with James being added to the Fong tribe, I I do think that makes Fong a pretty powerful tribe at that point, to where I think they're definitely a lot more even with Coda, where obviously on the real season, we do see Fong losing all the time to Coda. However, with James there, again, I do feel like that's a bit of a balancer between the two tribes. And I do think James fits in pretty well socially on that tribe. I think he would work alongside the Kenny and the Crystals of the world. I see him being largely affable there, and I don't really see him being booted until the merge phase of the game, though again, it's still James, and through that, no real faith in him getting to the very, very end. While on the Penner side of things, again, I do think Penner perfectly fits into the Onion Alliance. Like, I do think he probably would have also found himself in the core of the Onion Alliance. I could very much see him working alongside Corinne and Charlie and Marcus. Now, there's also a route where he just annoys them, and he isn't including that alliance, and obviously something to factor in here that I haven't really mentioned up to this point is threat level, where obviously these will technically be returning players, and through that they'll have targets on their backs, which I just decided to not even really factor that into this video, considering at that point it also makes things way too convoluted. But yeah, I could definitely see Penner fitting in with the majority alliance here, though again is another one that, while I think he could have a pretty deep run in him, I don't think he's ever truly part of the true core of Marcus and Charlie, and it's either a situation of him getting taken out pretty close to the end game or him simply being pagonged along the way. Next up, we're moving on to Joe, who in this situation would be on Survivor Samoa, which is weird thinking about the situation, as again, obviously there's no way they're bringing back Joe. But in this situation, I do think he would have probably taken the spot of Mick. That is the person that first came to my mind. However, I decided to say screw it and just swap him out with Ben, because Ben sucks. Now, in terms of longevity in the game, like, Joe probably makes it far. Now, again, if he is on Foa, obviously they do lose a lot of challenges, and through that, he could probably be taken out along the way, though he is the type of person that probably just makes the merge most time he plays, but also has no real game ability, to where I don't know how much further he makes it unless he is under the wing of Russell Hantz, and it's just part of the Foas that make it deep into the game. But realistically, I don't really see Joe having any true win equity on this season. Next up, we're finally moving on to a point in the video where I'm changing up the formula a bit, where the next Medevacs come from Survivor Samoa, where obviously we do have Mike Barassi and Russell Swan, and obviously if we were to follow this strict formula of them being on the following season, they would end up being on Heroes vs. Villains. However, I decided to not do that and instead put them on Survivor Nicaragua. Obviously, one, from the fact that Heroes vs. Villains was an all-star season with a theme, and really I don't think Mike Barassi fits that theme well at all. So the other factor is the fact that those seasons were filmed back to back, to which a medevac from one of these seasons is just very unlikely to be on the very following season in these back-to-back cycles. And really from this point forward, that's kind of how these situations will be handled, is that the medevac player will appear on the next cycle of seasons, not necessarily the immediate season following theirs. And through that, that also gives us the choice of which of the seasons in that cycle to put those players on, as again, I feel like there's certain situations that don't really work if you don't do it that way, which again we'll talk about. But here again, I did put both Mike Marassi and Russell Swan on Nicaragua, to which I guess both of them will be on the older tribe, which is kind of the weird aspect of all this, as obviously it was a young versus old season, though really I didn't feel like either of them particularly fit the Redemption Island cast that well, especially with Rob and Russell already being there. Now, the easy person to replace Mike Barassi with is Dan Lembo, as they're pretty much the exact same archetype. But Russell Swan, I ended up replacing with Tyrone, as they are like similar-ish archetypes. Really, I don't think they're that similar at all personality-wise, but at least in terms of their roles on the season as POC athletic men that are in their 40s. Again, Russell Swan kind of fits that role. And really, Mike Barassi here, I think, is probably a relatively early boot. I mean, even Dan Lembo, I think, had some affability to him that I think could have made him stay in there for a long haul, while Mike Barassi, I don't really see him having that as much on this tribe. I don't really see him clicking with this tribe as well. And considering how much they were focused on physical strength, I do feel like Mike Barassi would have been a pretty early boot here. Well, Russell Swan, I think, could definitely have some longevity here, where obviously Tyrone ends up getting essentially swap screwed. And I could definitely see Russell Swan being in a similar position, but I think he would be in a decent position on the original Spada tribe. Now, I do think there is a bit of a worry in terms of how he works with Marty, to where I think there is a world where the egos kind of clash a bit. But again, I do think there could be some longevity for Russell Swan, but yeah, I just feel like there's a high probability probability of him being screwed over by the swap, and even beyond that, probably doesn't have it in him to make it to the very end. Next up, moving on to One World, where here we did have 2 Medevacs in Courtney and Colton. However, I did end up putting them on different seasons. Colton, I did end up putting him on Survivor Philippines, as Survivor Philippines was literally a season that Colton was going to be on. He was on the initial cast and dropped at the last second due to the negative reception to him, to which they replaced him with Penner. So obviously we just put him in Penner's place, which, to be honest, I think is a bad spot for him. I think he's probably the first boot, as obviously he's not as likable as Penner and also brings less to the table physically than Penner, and I just think in general there's no reason to keep Colton around, so I would not be surprised if he's the first boot out of his tribe. Well, for Courtney Moon, I didn't end up putting her on Forever Caramoan. However, despite the season being fans versus favorites and there being an entire tribe of returning players, I actually decided to put her on the fans tribe just because I feel like there's an easier spot to fill her with there, where, I mean, we could easily just swap her out for the likes of a Julia, a Laura, an Allie, a Hope, any of these people. I would probably pick Julia as the person to replace her with, just because I feel like she probably brought the least to the table. And I could see them playing similar roles on their tribes. And again, I don't think Courtney Moon is that long for the game here either. While we never will truly know, I don't really get the sense that Courtney Moon really cared about the game that much and knew that much about the game. And through that, I don't really expect Courtney Moon to do that well. Next up, from Caramoan, we once again have 2 Medevacs on the board. And once again, I put them on 2 separate seasons. For Erik Reichenbach, I did put him on Blood vs. Water, which was, again, a half and half season. It makes a lot of sense to have Erik on the returnee tribe, to which I did end up replacing him with Aris. And through that means Vetus is probably replaced with Erik's brother, I guess. But I don't really see it going particularly well for Erik here. I feel like Erik's in this position where he doesn't really have many relationships on the returnee tribe here. I mean, as far as I know, I don't really see anyone here that feels like a natural ally for him. No one from his original season. No one that really feels like someone that he would have a somewhat decent relationship with. Or while I could see Erik kind of flying under radar and having a similar run to how he had in Caramoan, I really don't see many people that he would be working with here. We're also mixing that in with the fact that his Caramoan strategy was one that was just kind of bad. I do feel like his run here will probably not lead up to a win. Now, Shamar, I didn't end up putting Shamar on Cagayan, as obviously it doesn't really make much sense to have him on Blood vs. Water. Though on Cagayan, it was still kind of difficult choice here, as really the only person I could see replacing him with is Cliff Robinson. As, again, on a Brains vs. Beauty vs. Brawn season, I think Shamar, the only spot it makes sense to put him in is the Brawn tribe, and there it feels like the perfect swap is Cliff Robinson, which I think is a shame, considering I wouldn't want to lose Cliff Robinson. I don't know if it's for our production wouldn't want to lose Cliff Robinson, but for the sake of this exercise, I did put Shamar there, and I think his run goes around the same. I don't think he does particularly well, but is probably kept around due to his physical strength, probably is argumentative. I don't really see him bonding too well with Tony. I think that would be a weird dynamic, but at the same time, I don't think Shamar would have as close a relationship to Wu, to where I kind of see Shamar being on the outs here. Now, I don't know if he would be the first boot, considering he is this massive physical guy, but I still feel like he's a massive liability there, and one that I don't think is in it for the long haul. Now, the next cycle of seasons have a wide range of Medevacs here, where I am actually considering Terry for this video here from Cambodia, where obviously he wasn't taken out due to medical reasons. However, he was taken out due to his son's medical reasons. He had no choice in him being taken out of the game, so I decided to still keep Terry for this video. Well, also from Ko Wrong, we do have 3 Medevacs on that season, from Caleb, Neil, and Joe. Now, Neil and Joe, I did end up putting on Millennials or Gen X, even though Joe is not really Gen X, but they both end up being on the Gen X tribe, which again is kind of a strange thing as a Nicaragua situation, but it kind of has to be this way. But I think there are easy replacements here. I think Joe replaces Paul, and Paul was the oldest person on that tribe. Now Joe becomes the new oldest person on that tribe. While I think Neil easily replaces Ken. Again, they're also similar-ish in age. While otherwise, I don't really see a 1-for-1 swap out for Neil, so I think Ken is probably the person you go with. As for how they do in the game, I think Joe is a lot more affable than Paul, to where I don't think he's as early of a boot. And also, I think Joe is someone that I can kind of see working with some of the people that Paul wasn't working with. I can kind of see Joe working alongside of David on this season, and just in general, I do think Joe has a decent amount of longevity if he isn't being voted out due to physical strength, but even then, I don't necessarily see him winning the game. While Neil swapping with Ken, I think is also in a somewhat decent-ish spot. I could see Neil working alongside David. I could also see Neil working alongside the Brett and Chris's of the world. Like, I think Neil is in a somewhat decent spot here, though it is still Neil, and through that, I would not be surprised if he gets a bit cocky at points and gets blindsided along the way, though I think at least on his initial starting tribe, he should be in a decent spot. Moving on to Survivor Game Changers, where this is where obviously we're putting Caleb, as Caleb was literally brought back for Survivor Game Changers, and it will obviously play the same considering that literally happened. However, this is also where I'm going to put Terry, where obviously, as I mentioned, I am including Terry here, and I think it just makes sense to put him on Game Changers, the next returning season to happen in the next cycle. Now, the person that Terry replaces is a bit of an interesting question here, as I think there's a couple routes we can take. We can obviously replace him with Brett Culpepper, which would put him on the Blue Tribe, where there, I think he easily just works alongside JT, Ozzy, and probably Sarah, and through that, I could see Terry having a deep run on that season, though otherwise he would replace someone like a Troyzan, maybe a Varner. Realistically, I think Varner is probably the person that I see him swapping out with the most, in the fact that obviously production very much liked Brad, and Troyzan wanted to give him a second chance, while Varner obviously just had his second chance, and considering they're both from Cambodia anyway, I feel like Terry probably swaps out with Varner, to where I don't really know exactly where he lands on this side of things. I don't really feel like he has as many connections on the Red Tribe, to where I can see him working with Sandra, with them having this like old school connection there. And I could also see him bonding with the likes of a Malcolm and even a Tony, even though I don't think they really would click strategically. But again, I really don't know exactly where Terry lands on this tribe, though he should be relatively safe for the short term though. Next up, we're moving on to Pat Cusick, who, again, moving on to the next cycle, there's only one season to put him on, and that's IOI, because he's not Winners at War. However, there's also an easy replacement on IOI, as obviously just take out Dan Spilo, because we don't need Dan Spilo. And I think Pat could be on an interesting spot on that tribe. I could definitely see him working alongside Janet and Tommy in a similar way to Dan was. I could see him being very close to Elaine if he meets her post-swap, though at the same time, I do feel like Pat was a much more confrontational figure than Dan, so I could definitely see Pat getting into fights with people earlier on in his season, where maybe that can cause him to be on the outs. But realistically, I kind of see Pat doing somewhat well on this season. I kind of see him being with the group that did end up controlling a lot of the game moving forward, though again, I don't really see him having the killer instinct to actually end up winning the game, especially over the likes of a Tommy. And the final medevac that we're going to be talking about here comes from Survivor 42, and we do have Jackson, where now we are putting Jackson on Survivor 43, and looking at the 43 cast, I feel like there's only one person to really swap him out with. And strangely, it's the winner of the season in Gabler. As really outside that, I don't really know who else there is this one-for-one comparison with here, as Gabler was the older guy on the cast. So again, I think Jackson is put in that spot to where, really, I think Jackson's probably still an early boot. Now, from what we learned post-show, it does seem like Jackson would have been the first boot from Taku if they ever went to Tribal, and really, I see a similar trajectory to him on 43. I don't really feel like he gels that well with this tribe, where I could definitely still see the Ellie and Janine's kind of running the show early on, and at that point it's really more so based on Jackson's relationships with them, on if he survives the first round, or again, I do think it would have been between him and Mariah. If he does survive that round, then obviously they don't go to Tribal again until post-merge, though at the same time, would that be different if Jackson was there? Who knows? And post-merge, I don't really see him doing the same things that Gabler did and blowing up Ellie's spot, but again, you never know. Realistically, again, I don't think there's a long run for Jackson here, especially considering how honor-bound of a player he seemed to be in the preseason of 42, but it would not surprise me if he does have that chaotic side to him as well, but again, I don't really expect that much out of him. But there we go, and that is every Survivor what-if situation if a medevac player was on the following season, which obviously we're about to see with Survivor 45 and see how Bruce does, so that will obviously be interesting. But obviously just expect more of the same type of videos moving forward, and obviously just expect the typical coverage for Survivor 45 as the season goes along, mid-season power ranking, season review, player ranking at the end, so stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.